So, welcome everyone. I'm going to be talking about games quality insurance and why you need it, yo. So, before we get started, who am I? As Willem mentioned, I'm actually working at Rainbow Unicorn Games as a release engineer, helping them work on some Android projects and releasing mobile titles using Unity. But I actually began my games career in games QA. I did games QA for about 4 years. Ended up becoming a lead QA analyst, where I had a small team working on titles for all sorts of consoles, from the Wii to the PSP to the DS to the iPhone and early days of mobile. But from there, I done a lot of software development work, working on games, and bunch of jobs that use games related technology to make things like fashion design software. And I just recently participated in the level 3 where we released the game Hyper Bimbo Beats, which is where you use unfor- unapologetic fempop power to take on toxic masculinity. And it's actually available now on Android and iOS, so quick little plug there. But what I'm going to be talking about is Games QA. So the first thing I want to talk about is, what is Games QA? Some people think Games QA is just playing games, especially parents. It's like, oh, you just want to play games all day, and it's really more than that. It's really about being analytical, kind of using observation to find issues. Games QA really is that safety net that prevents buggy games or big issues from making it out into the wild. And we all could probably think of at least one example where, like, they just let certain bugs out into the wild and everyone finds out because nothing's hidden from the internet. And with games QA, there's still decisions made if something gets released or not, but the more QA you have on your games, the less likely those problems end up in the wild. And that's why, like, games QA ends up being really important, and that kind of leads to the why is games QA. And that's more of like that thing of making sure your games are actually like tested properly. You're actually diving in deeply, making sure things are working properly. You're giving feedback to the designers, like saying this doesn't really make sense from a player's perspective. um when you're working games QA, your why really is being that force for the player, pushing like what the player would be best for the player. Like, the player is your why. That's what you're there for, as games QA. And it really does take a lot of like thinking as a player, putting the play yourself in the player's shoes, really pushing what the player wants, what's gonna actually ruin the player's experience and throw them off. And that really is key to it. And what really goes into testing is planning. And usually leads or QA directors will work together in creating an actual test plan. And what a test plan is, it's basically coming up with different ways you want to test the game to make sure it functions properly. You may create like test scripts, which are basically recipes for how you want to test your game, the ways you're going to go about testing the different aspects of your game, and the test cases are your individual things that you're testing. So, say you have a game like an Infinite Runner, and you want to make sure that the actual moving to the side controls work, then you're going to create a test case based on just seeing, hey, does left right actually work when it gets pressed and do what it's supposed to do? Or if I collide with something I'm not supposed to, will the game do what it's supposed to in there? So when it comes to test planning, you may see a whole suite of like scripts and lots of documents going through individual scenarios and cases that actually need to be tested for a game before it can be given the green light to be released or sent to like manufacturers. And that leads to what types of testing there is. And we'll sit on this slide for a bit. If anyone wants to take a screenshot just so they can kind of have the different list of it. But functional testing is testing out your game features, seeing if like, hey, can I go from menu to the level? Can I actually use like the core functionality of the game? If there's a jump mechanic, does the jump mechanic work properly when I jump? Or is it impossible for it to make all jumps because it just doesn't have enough like force to get across like big gaps? Maybe there's a design issue because of that. Then there's ad hoc testing, which is testing for things that get very close to unexpected behavior in a way, or testing to see if the game can be completed properly. Like destructive, that's the idea where you're gonna take a controller and you're gonna do things that people wouldn't normally do, or in a level you're gonna say, hey, I'm gonna try and force my way through the outer bounds of the wall and see if I can get through in this little corner right here. And that's where like ad hoc testing is focused on. It's those things that are outside of the normal. Regression testing, that's just testing bugs that you've already reported to make sure they've been fixed or not. So it's just checking to make sure old fixes are still in there, because sometimes it happens where they do a new fix and they accidentally, like a programmer may accidentally undo a previous fix, and it happens. So that's where regression testing helps to be like, oh hey, the fix you did like got undone with another fix or something. Localization, that's checking to see if the languages match up and they actually are right for whatever region languages you're testing. Compatibility is making sure the games you're working on actually deploy and work on every single device you're targeting. And the last one, which is a unique one because it's based on hardware manufacturers. Technical requirements testing is literally getting like a booklet worth of like documents that you have to test for specific consoles, and each console has different request requirements. Like Nintendo is going to have very different checks for that compared to like a PlayStation or Xbox, because you have to deal with touchscreen. If you're dealing with touchscreen, how do you deal with that? With PlayStation, you have the touchpad. Is it going to be the same kind of functionality? Is it going to be different? And like they have different ways they want the hardware to behave. How does it go to the home menu? How does it behave with the home menu? And that's why it's like that's usually that's a more technical skill set that you can be taught, or like most companies groom someone into, because it requires a lot more in-depth working with the hardware itself compared to the other types of testing. And this is something that I was taught when I actually spent time at my games QA. Um, because I did so well, they decided, hey, took a few of us and they taught us how to actually work with consoles. And you learn that like working with the developer hardware, you have access to actually simulate certain things that you can't actually do with consumer hardware as well. So when it comes to actually reporting bugs, though, this here is basically going to be your recipe to how to report bugs. And the most important thing when reporting bugs is going to be details. So when you're writing a title, you're going to want to make the title clear of what you're reporting, but you also want to make sure that it's clear what the priority is. Certain bugs have different priorities. If it fails a technical requirements test, it's usually a much higher priority, because Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft, Apple, they will fail you instantly if it doesn't hit those requirements. While like if it's something simple, it's like, hey, this green is too green or something like that, that could be considered a low priority bug, or if it's like causing issues. But with accessibility becoming a big thing, colors actually start ending up in like a higher tier, so they may be a high priority instead of urgent or something like that. Observe results. This is where you're gonna want to let basically who you're reporting the bug to know. It's like, hey, this is what I'm seeing happening, and this will be detailed and explained. It's like, hey, when I go to this place in level 2, I'm able to jump on this box 3 times, and I've seen that they actually drop through the level. And to follow that up, you would then go through the steps of how you actually like found the bug. So you'd be like, step one, I did this, player did this, player did that, player did this, and then bam, by step 5, it's like then the thing happens. Expected results, that's going to be your chance to say, hey, this isn't the behavior that's supposed to happen. This is the behavior we're supposed to see. It's like if a player jumps on a box, they shouldn't fall through the level. And the reason I always keep mentioning player is because when you're documenting bugs, you always want to use the term player because you want to make it clear that it's from the player's perspective that this bug can happen, instead of like saying I, you, or any kind of ambiguous term. It just helps get everyone in the mindset that this is the person that we're trying to do this for, and this is the person who's most likely going to encounter this.